I want to start today with something that happened last night in Washington that I think is one of the most revealing moments of this entire 84-day conflict. And I say that having watched a great many revealing moments over the past 3 months. The Republican Party, the party of the president who launched this war, the party that has supported this war from the beginning, the party whose leadership has been telling the American public that this war is necessary, justified, and succeeding. That party last night pulled its own Iran war resolution off the floor of the House of Representatives, not because it was going to fail, but because it was about to pass. Let me say that again so it is completely clear. Republicans canceled their own vote because their own members were going to vote against the war. The vote was on the verge of passing. And rather than allow that to happen, rather than allow the world to see that the Republican Party is fracturing over Iran, the leadership pulled the plug. I have been watching American politics for a very long time. I cannot recall a moment quite like this one, when a party's leadership is so afraid of its own members' votes that it cancels the vote entirely. You are looking at a political party in genuine internal crisis. And that crisis has direct, immediate consequences for what happens next in this war. Now, I want to explain why this matters so much, not just as a political story, but as a strategic one. Donald Trump's leverage in the Iran negotiations rests ultimately on the credibility of his threat to resume military operations. He has been saying for weeks now that if Iran doesn't give him the right answers, the bombs will fall again. He canceled a scheduled strike on Tuesday because Pakistan's mediator brought a message that suggested Iran was close to a counter-proposal. He said he was willing to wait a few more days. He said talks are on the borderline between a deal and resumed war. That threat, the threat of resumed war, and is only credible if Trump can actually execute it. And executing it requires maintaining sufficient domestic political support to withstand the inevitable backlash. The Republican Party's near revolt on the House floor last night tells Tehran something very important, that political support is not as solid as it appears, that the cracks are real, that the Republicans who are privately uncomfortable with this war are getting closer to the moment when they will express that discomfort publicly in the form of a binding vote. Tehran is watching this. Ahmad Vahidi, the hardline IRGC general I analyzed yesterday, the man who is now at the center of Iran's decision-making, is watching this. And what he sees is a president whose domestic political position is weakening in real time, whose own party is on the verge of publicly breaking with him over the war, and whose leverage in the negotiations is therefore declining with every passing week. This does not mean Iran will now accept American terms. I want to be very clear about that. The congressional dynamics in Washington do not solve the fundamental incompatibility between what Trump needs from the deal and what Vahidi can accept. But it does affect the timeline. It affects Iran's calculation of how long it can hold out, and it affects the credibility of the one instrument and the threat of resumed strikes that Washington still has left to pressure Tehran. Let me now turn to what Marco Rubio said yesterday because his statement is important and I think it has been somewhat misread in the initial coverage. Rubio told reporters in Miami that there are good signs that an agreement to end the conflict is in sight. He also said that any deal would be unfeasible if Iran pursues its plan to permanently control shipping through the Strait of Hormuz with the tolling system. He said, and I am quoting him directly, "No one in the world is in favor of a tolling system. It can't happen, and it would be unacceptable." Now, on the surface, this sounds like American confidence. Good signs. Agreement in sight. That is the language of diplomatic optimism. But read the second part of Rubio's statement carefully. He is telling Iran, publicly, through the press, in the clearest possible diplomatic language, that the Hormuz tolling system is a deal breaker. That no agreement is possible if Iran maintains its claim to charge ships for passage through the strait. And here is the problem. Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the government agency that vets and taxes ships seeking passage through Hormuz, is not a negotiating position. It is a structural fact. It exists. It is operating. It has been operating for weeks. Iranian state television has been reporting on it. Countries have been quietly negotiating with it. Chinese ships have been passing through it. The tolling system is not something Iran is threatening to do in the future. It is something Iran is already doing right now. When Rubio says the tolling system can't happen, he is describing something that has already happened. And when he calls it unacceptable, he is describing a reality that Iran has already created on the ground and has zero incentive to dismantle as long as it remains Iran's most effective leverage instrument. This is the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the current state of negotiations. The United States is describing as unacceptable and impossible something that Iran has already made possible and is currently implementing. And no amount of diplomatic optimism, no good signs, no final stages language changes the fact that bridging that gap requires one side to accept an outcome that it has publicly declared unacceptable. I want to spend a moment on Pakistan because today's developments add an important dimension to the mediation role that Islamabad has been playing throughout this conflict. Pakistan's Army Chief Asim Munir was in Tehran yesterday. He carried Washington's latest proposal. He met with Iranian officials. And what emerged from those meetings, at least from what has been made public, is that Iran is reviewing America's position. That several rounds of communication have taken place, that Pakistan continues to mediate. What has not emerged is anything concrete. No framework agreed, no timeline established. No announcement that the core gaps on enrichment, on Hormuz, on the sequencing of concessions have been bridged or even narrowed. I have enormous respect for what Pakistan is attempting. Asim Munir is doing something genuinely courageous and genuinely difficult. He is flying between capitals, carrying messages that each side finds partially unacceptable, trying to find the language that allows both parties to say yes to something. But the fact that he is on his third or fourth visit to Tehran in 2 weeks does not tell me the talks are going well. It tells me the gaps remain large enough that each trip reveals new problems that require another trip to address. But what happened next in the diplomatic sphere was something I want to draw your careful attention to because it has barely been covered and it changes the picture significantly. Trump tested what one report described as his economic messaging as Republicans stood up. Think about what that phrase means. The President of the United States, on the 84th day of a war that was supposed to be over in days, is testing his economic messaging. He is workshopping language. He is trying to figure out how to explain to the American public why gas prices are high, why inflation is elevated, why the economy feels strained. That is not the behavior of a president who is winning a war. It is the behavior of a president who is managing the political consequences of a war that has not produced the results he promised. And that distinction matters enormously for understanding where we are. Let me talk about what I consider the most underreported dimension of today's situation because I think it explains more about the likely trajectory of this conflict than either the Republican revolt or Rubio's Hormuz statement. Iran has, over the course of 84 days, demonstrated something that the architects of this war genuinely did not anticipate. It has demonstrated that it can simultaneously absorb a major military assault, maintain its political system, prosecute a multidimensional strategic campaign, and conduct serious diplomatic negotiations, all at the same time. Most governments, under the kind of military pressure Iran has experienced, would have either collapsed or capitulated. Iran has done neither. And the reason it has done neither is precisely because the people making decisions in Tehran, people like Vahidi, have concluded, correctly or not, that resistance is more likely to produce a sustainable outcome than concession. I am not defending Iran's political system. I am describing its strategic logic, and understanding that logic is essential for understanding why the negotiations are where they are after 84 days. The Republican revolt that was suppressed last night will not stay suppressed. The political dynamics in Washington that produced it, the eroding domestic support, the economic pain of elevated gas prices, the trillion-dollar cost projection, the depleted weapons stockpiles, those dynamics are not going away. They are, if anything, intensifying. And every day that passes without a deal, every day that the Hormuz crisis continues and gas prices stay elevated and the economy strains, is a day that adds to the political pressure on Republican members to break publicly with a president whose war is becoming increasingly difficult to defend. I want to be honest with you about something that I think the current diplomatic optimism, Rubio's good signs, Trump's final stages language, the constant references to Pakistan's mediation producing results, is obscuring. The fundamental incompatibilities that have prevented a deal for 84 days have not been resolved. They have not even been significantly narrowed, as far as I can tell from the available evidence. What has happened is that both sides have gotten better at managing the public presentation of the negotiations, while the underlying gaps remain as wide as they were when the ceasefire was announced on April 8th. Let me walk through those gaps very precisely because I think the media coverage has been too vague about what is actually being negotiated. Gap number 1, uranium enrichment. The United States wants Iran to commit to zero enrichment. Iran will not commit to zero enrichment. The one-page framework that was reported last week would have Iran accept a moratorium on enrichment for somewhere between 10 and 20 years. Iran has not publicly accepted any moratorium. Its foreign ministry continues to insist on its NPT rights. This gap is not closed. Gap number 2, the Strait of Hormuz. The United States says the Hormuz tolling system is unacceptable and cannot be part of any deal. Iran's Hormuz tolling system already exists and is operating. Iran sees it as its most effective remaining leverage instrument and has no incentive to dismantle it before securing the concessions it wants. This gap is not closed. Gap number 3, the sequencing of concessions. The United States wants Iran to make concessions on the nuclear question before sanctions are lifted and the naval blockade is ended. Iran wants the sanctions lifted and the blockade ended before it makes any concessions on the nuclear question. This fundamental disagreement about who moves first has not been resolved. Gap number 4, compensation and legitimacy. Iran wants the United States to acknowledge that the February 28th strikes were illegal under international law. The United States will not acknowledge this. Iran wants reconstruction assistance and compensation for war damages. The United States has offered none. This gap is not closed. 4 gaps. 4 fundamental structural incompatibilities. And 84 days of fighting, 3 ceasefire attempts, multiple rounds of Pakistan-mediated negotiations, and a canceled military strike have not moved any of them significantly. I want to be clear about what I think this means. It does not necessarily mean that a deal is impossible. Diplomatic history is full of cases where gaps that appeared unbridgeable were eventually bridged through creative formulations, face-saving ambiguity, and the kind of pressure that only genuine exhaustion and economic pain can generate. The two sides may yet find a formula, some deliberately vague language about Hormuz, some ambiguous commitment on enrichment, some financial arrangement that allows Iran to claim it received compensation without the United States explicitly admitting wrongdoing. But such a formula would require both sides to accept outcomes they have publicly declared unacceptable. And in the current political environment, and with Trump testing his economic messaging and Republicans suppressing revolts on the House floor and Iran's hardline generals firmly in control of decision-making in Tehran, the political space for that kind of flexible, face-saving compromise is extremely narrow. Let me now talk about what I think actually happens over the next week or two, because I think we are approaching a genuine decision point, not another false dawn, not another ceasefire extension, but an actual fork in the road where the parties have to choose between a compromise deal and a return to war. Here's why I believe the next 2 weeks are genuinely decisive, in a way that the previous 6 weeks were not. Trump has publicly committed to waiting a few more days for Iran's response. He has been saying this since May 19th. Those few days are running out. The domestic political pressure, from the Republican revolt, from the economic data, from the midterm election arithmetic that says every week of elevated gas prices costs him votes, is not decreasing. And the military preparations that the New York Times reported are real. They require maintenance, and they cannot be held in a state of suspended execution indefinitely. On the Iranian side, the review of Washington's proposal cannot go on forever either. Every week of continued Hormuz disruption imposes economic costs on Iran's trading partners, including China, whose patience is not unlimited. The Karg Island oil spill is still spreading. The civilian infrastructure damage inside Iran is accumulating, and the internal political dynamics in Tehran, the wounded supreme leader in hiding, the factional competition between hardliners and pragmatists, the genuine uncertainty about who ultimately makes decisions, are creating pressures that will eventually force some kind of resolution in one direction or another. What I expect to happen, and I want to be clear this is my assessment, not a prediction, is that one of two things occurs in the next 2 weeks. Either Pakistan's mediation produces a framework agreement that is sufficiently vague on the core issues to allow both sides to claim a victory. A document that says something like, Iran will cooperate with IAEA on its nuclear program, without specifying what that means, and Hormuz will remain open for international navigation without specifying how that will be enforced. And both sides accept it because the alternative is worse. Or the few days Trump promised to wait expire without an acceptable Iranian response, and the United States resumes military operations, not the full-scale bombardment of the early weeks, but targeted strikes on Iranian military infrastructure designed to increase pressure without triggering the kind of massive escalation that would close Hormuz permanently and activate Iran's beyond-the-region contingency. I give the first scenario, the vague face-saving deal, roughly 40% probability. I give the second scenario, resumed targeted strikes, roughly 35% probability. And I give the third scenario, continued stalemate, another week of reviewing, another extension, roughly 25% probability. None of these are good outcomes. The vague deal leaves the core issues unresolved and guarantees another crisis in 5 or 10 years when the enrichment moratorium expires or the Hormuz arrangement breaks down. The resumed strikes risk triggering the escalation that nobody wants and that Iran has explicitly threatened. And the continued stalemate simply extends the economic pain, for Americans paying $4.52 a gallon, for Iranians who can't afford to eat, for the global economy that is being slowly strangled by a partial Hormuz closure that has already lasted 84 days. The Republican leadership's decision to cancel last night's vote is significant precisely because it reveals the narrow margin within which Trump is operating. He is not working from a position of domestic political strength. He is managing a political coalition that is increasingly restive, an economy under stress, a military that has been significantly strained by 3 months of intensive operations, and a diplomatic situation in which every available option carries severe costs. And on the other side of the table, Ahmad Vahidi and his colleagues are looking at all of this and calculating. They are calculating whether Trump's threats are credible. They are calculating whether the congressional revolt represents a genuine shift in American political will. They are calculating whether the economic pressure on their trading partners, particularly China, will eventually translate into pressure on Tehran to make concessions. And they are calculating whether the deal that is being offered is better or worse than the deal they can extract through continued resistance. That calculation, made by hardline IRGC commanders who have spent their careers building Iran's deterrent capacity and who genuinely believe that concession is surrender, is the calculation that will determine whether this war ends in the next 2 weeks or continues into its fourth month. I don't know how Ahmad Vahidi is calculating right now. I don't know if Pakistan's Asim Munir, on his multiple visits to Tehran, has found the key that unlocks a different Iranian response. I don't know if the vague, face-saving formula exists in a form that both Trump and Vahidi can accept. What I know is this: the Republican Party nearly voted last night to constrain its own president's war powers. And the leadership suppressed that vote not because the members were wrong to want it, but because they were right. Because the political reality is that this war is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, increasingly expensive, and increasingly disconnected from the decisive victory that was promised when it was launched. That is the message being sent from Washington tonight to Tehran, to Islamabad, to Beijing, to every government watching this conflict and drawing its own conclusions about American power and American will. The question is whether it is being received correctly, and whether the people receiving it have the wisdom and the flexibility to turn that message into the foundation of a settlement before the bombs start falling again. That is my assessment for today. Watch this space very carefully. The next 72 hours matter more than almost anything that has happened in the previous 84 days.